Hello everyone, my name is Maxim Schunar, and today we're going to be talking again about the Waloon hilt. So I had a few people asking me questions about the last video I did on the Waloon hilt, and we're going to try to answer them today. So the first question I got asked is, can you tell us more about the design and the origin of the Waloon hilt? So mostly about the shape of the hilt itself. So one thing that's important to consider about the Waloon hilt is that although the name is Waloon, the origin is much more German. So Waloon hilt is a term that was used in mostly the 19th century, and I think the term was really used in the 17th and 18th century. This is a term like many other names for sword, like the Sinclair hilt or the Kadishmard. These are terms that were not necessarily used back then, but were not necessarily invented, but they were popularized at least by 19th century sword collectors. And the Waloon hilt, of course, got its name because it was very popular in that region in the 17th century. So, but the origin of the sword itself is German. So, in Germany, a lot of these swords are called Haldigen. So, they were made, well, the evolution of this sword starts with the sac or dosage, dosage, not really sure how to pronounce it, but swords, cutting swords and cutlasses with very complex hilts. Some of them actually, when you look at them, are really over the top in terms of complexity. You have an incredible number of branches on the hilt. You have, of course, the thumb rings that appears, and you have these enormous. Some of them are just plain ridiculous. Enormous quillons, and just the back quillen sometimes is like a foot long, and I'm not really sure why, and nobody has given me a really good explanation. But anyway, I think this is kind of the apex of the complexity of hilts, and there was definitely a taste in 16th century for the grotesque and the opulent, over the top look in fashion and art, and I would say in sword design as well. And so the Waloon hilt is much a child of this design. When swords start to become much more streamlined, much more minimal in a way, so it retains some aspect of the dosage, but it's much more cut down a little bit. So these, I'll call them kind of joints that you see in the guards are appearing again with some of the late dosage. This one is probably an early form of it because, again, of the blade, the guard, which is not necessarily properly a typical Waloon hilt, and also because of these junctions here that are a little bit bigger than they would usually be. And I think these were probably put there to reinforce the whole assemblage of the hilt and the branches, because you can see this is a very thin branch, so it can, I guess, easily break. If you put something like this here, I guess it would probably solidify it, but you know, I'm not an engineer, so this is my opinion on it. Now, coming back to the guard, as I was saying before, the guard is usually in a heart-shaped form. Now, why is it such a shape? Well, it mostly goes down to practicality. If you have a figure 8 guard, like you see in some rapiers and some small swords, of course, the idea is that you want to be able to trap a blade in the front of the guard. With a Waloon hilt, which is going to be used mostly for cutting, you don't want this. You don't want another person's sword to be caught up in your blade. So instead, you're going to be making it heart-shaped so that the blades are deviated like this. So that when you parry with the blade, if a hit comes onto your guard, it's deviated away from your hand and away from your sword. It doesn't become trapped in the middle, right? And it's a little bit rounder, a little bit larger at the back here so that it protects your hand effectively in your arm when you're in a good guard, right? So that's the idea behind it. And about the apertures, well, the idea, again, I think this is an early form because those apertures are very minimal, but I think in the case of many, the case of the Waloon hilt itself, the idea was that they were replicating the style that was very popular with swords such as Pappenheimers, rapiers, that you're going to see some of them here, and this is an assembly that was also copied in some cases on some Dussacs, some type of broadswords, and you can really see an evolution of these guards becoming a little bit more filled, and again a little bit more streamlined compared to earlier late 16th century types of German cutting swords. So how did this become popular elsewhere? I talked a little bit about this prior to the prior video, but we're going to be talking a little bit more about this now. So the Waloon hilt was very much a German design, but it became very popular in Swedish and even Dutch armies in the 17th century. And as I said before, when the French soldiers came to the region, to the Netherlands and Flanders, they came back at the end of the war and had probably, say, stolen or acquired in some way some of these swords, and they were very happy with the way that they performed. So the king, the French king Louis XIV, issued an order to one of his ministers to make available a universal type of pattern that would be based on these types of swords, and that would be made available to the various colonels commanding French army regiments. And so this was a huge undertaking, right? So you have to imagine that very few armies actually had official patterns back then, and even less so a single unified pattern for their whole infantry and even their whole cavalry, because this was also part of the order. So, and to add on this, imagine an army the size of France. So France had one of the largest army in Europe, and for them to suddenly make this order to the makers in Solingen and Passau, this was a huge thing that probably had never seen before. So they were probably overwhelmed by the order, right? So they came up with this design, which was basically very familiar type for them. And we can see that there's probably some variations, again, because they were there were many different makers making this pattern, and we don't really know, interestingly, what the pattern initially looked like. So we have official documents talking about the order that was made by the minister, but we don't know what the sword itself would have looked like. We've established what it looks like from examples that remain today that we think are probably the 1679 pattern, and also from painting. You can see here a painting from the Battle of Danay, which took place in 1712, and on the back of these soldiers here you can see the 1679 pattern, really exactly as the one I showed before. So this pattern was very popular in the French army with soldiers. It was used not only in the 16th century, but all the way up to the mid 17th century, and for many cavalrymen, the pattern even became, it was even used up until the late 18th century, up to the French Revolution. So this pattern was, even though it was, there were other patterns that were made, it was still part of it. We can find actually examples of this hilt in various archaeological sites here in North America. When the French came, and they sometimes when you do archaeological digs in some of the French forts like Duquesne or Niagara or Chambly, you can easily find in some of the reports and assemblage some Waloon hilts that remain, and in various forms. So a very popular type of sword that was made at the time. Another interesting tidbit about this sword that I think a lot of people ignore, or at least don't really think about, is that while the Waloon hilt is very much liked in HEMA circles, it's got this solid steel hilt, you know. It's got this good cutting and thrusting edge. Looks very solid, very like a very good sword. But it also evolved into different types of sword that are not so well liked. If you look at a Waloon hilt, you'll see some characteristics that come back in later swords, and such as the very malign spadroon. And I think this is probably where the whole idea comes from, when eventually the Waloon hilt, which already at the time, even in the 17th century, was very often equipped with spadroon blades, really. You see them, they starting very broad, but then ending up in a very, very fine point. And you can see these hilts slowly mutating into much more, again, streamlined hilts, the pommel remaining, but some of the assemblage on the hilt disappearing, the apertures becoming solids, sometimes made out of completely of brass, the thumb ring, of course, also disappearing, and eventually I think this became what we now see as the typical military spadroons of the late 18th century and up until the end of the 19th century, such as the very infamous 1796 spadroon for the British Army. So you know these swords have an ancestor, and I very much think that this is the Waloon hilt, as it was very popular in the Continental armies at the time. So that's about all I had to say about the Waloon hilt today. So I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe and visit my my blog and my website, I Don't Do Longsword and ISellSwords.com. And next video, we're going to be talking about a different subject. We're going to be talking about canes. So stay tuned.